what distinguishes us versus animals and things like that. But this is the simple way of thinking about it exactly, which is we all have an internal generative model of the world that parameterizes what we believe about the external world. There has been quite the assault on truth with a capital T, right? People are now free to come up with their own truths in a sense. For me, very simply, the way I thought about it is that which is invariant to time and space.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode. I'm really excited to welcome Tomer Solomon. Tomer's a thinker and researcher. He recently released a paper that we were going to talk about today called A Unified Process Theory of Meaning. It's a research paper that introduces a preliminary unified process theory of meaning with the objective of deepening our understanding of human nature and cultivating a meaningful life in modernity. Let's go ahead and dive into it. Tomer, welcome so much. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Rick, for having me. Big fan of you and your work, and looking forward to diving in more and engaging in this conversation.
So I'm curious about this paper. What caused you to come around to the point where you want to write this? Because it seemed like you were involved in the business world with Carta and some other work that you've been doing, but it seems like this sort of manifested over time. What got you to start thinking about this idea of meaning and manifesting and the modernity aspects of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. How does someone grapple with this concept of meaning? Obviously, it's an idea that we play around quite often with, whether you read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or whether you read Nietzsche or whether you're a philosophy fan. This elusive concept of meaning is something that, crosses the mind for quite a few folks. And I decided might as well formalize some of the thinking of what I've been doing. How did this come about? So as you mentioned, my career started in investment banking. And I graduated from Columbia, where I was really interested in computational neuroscience research. But then the siren songs of finance being in New York were a little bit too strong to not listen to. So spent a couple of years in investment banking. And I found that oftentimes, despite outward markers of success, there'd be times in which folks, myself and my friends, would be disillusioned with the type of work that we were doing, sometimes moving logos around a spreadsheet. Important work, of course. And so I was interested in finding more meaningful and fulfilling work. So I moved from New York's Wall Street to Silicon Valley to join a technology company. And even there, you're sold a myth of progress and techno-optimism, but you're undersold what real authenticity and real meaning looks like. And so for me, I was really interested in diving in and exploring this at a deeper level to kind of cultivate more meaning for me personally. And that was the genesis. And of course, this cultural malaise that I felt at a personal level with my relationship with work also manifests at broader scales too, where oftentimes I think we associate progress with increase in technology, but it's really the relationship that we have with our technology and the relationship that we have with the environment that I think can go missing in the modern world that is so technologically focused. So I asked myself, what does it mean to be a human in the modern world based on this relationship that I had with work and based on the impact that I saw our progress in technology was having. And this is what manifested here, which is this unified process theory of meaning, which I'm happy to get into.
And so you were in the investment banking world. And of course, some of these themes happen over time. The more deluged you get into the technical trading aspects, the economics aspects, things like Markov blankets and Markov chains, those sorts of things, they seem to arise over time. And it seems like some of these themes may have overlap in areas outside of statistics and the finance industry into maybe perhaps reality from the bit that I could gather from your paper. Again, I'm in investment banking right now, and so I'm stuck at a desk all day every day. So the occasion that I get to read about something different is always refreshing, but I'm often out of my element. So you came up with this thesis that you say is simple. It says that meaning manifests when the pattern of nature and the pattern of man match. So try to tease that a little bit. What do you mean by meaning? What do you mean by manifests?
I tried to think about this from a first principles perspective and kind of pull threads and see where I go from there. So I started with the world of computational neuroscience and trying to understand how our brain works. And you alluded to this with the concept of Markov blankets, but I came across Carl Friston's work. Carl Friston is a computational neuroscientist who came up with what's called the free energy principle, and as a way to understand how the brain works. And I actually coincidentally did some research in computational neuroscience in undergrad, specifically in the Bayesian brain. So as I was kind of, searching through nuggets of my old work in computational neuroscience and philosophy, it was really interesting to see where the latest evolution of thought was when it came to the world of computational neuroscience. And I came across these Markov blankets, which are essentially a way to formalize identity. They are a way to mathematically formalize the difference between conditionally independent internal and external states that are mediated through sensory and active states. So I took a look at these Markov blankets, and typically in the world of, machine learning or artificial intelligence, there's, the interactions between an agent and its environment. For some reason, I took a look at these Markov blankets and I said, actually, wait a minute. Could this be a connective tissue between the world of mathematics and philosophy, where Markov blankets, if there's a distinction between internal and external states where Markov blankets capture an internal pocket of order, it's a formalism for identity. And also what you get with Markov blankets is a formalism potentially for existence, because to maintain your Markov blanket boundary is to self-evidence in the language of Bayesian statistics, which is to confirm that you are what you are, which is to exist. So I said, okay, that's also interesting too. There's a formalism for existence. And then even taking it a step further, can you get a formalization for concepts of being? I know you've talked on your channel, the concept of maximal being, and Aquinas and other folks also have this concept of being. And so I said, actually, would it be interesting if this concept of being can be formally defined mathematically with this, what's called non-equilibrium steady state density that you get as part of the free energy principle. So I saw these connective tissues where Markov blankets were used in the world of mathematics, but if interpreted in a more potentially open-minded way, you could also get formalisms for other concepts in philosophy. And that opens a whole can of worms to think about things from there. So that was kind of the interest with Markov blankets. Yeah.
And so I want to take a step back. I'm going to ask you to clarify in very simple terms, what do you mean by Bayesian? And then you also what a Markov blanket is, and obviously, how many generations there you're talking about there, and what sort of the relationships or work there in the simplest form before we get too much deeper into it. Because I think those two principles are very central to a lot of your work and be helpful for those of us that are from a non-statistical, non-philosophical family of work to understand that. But so first of all, what do you mean when you say Bayesian, and what do you mean by when you say Markov blanket?
Yes. So in the world of the Bayesian world, very simply, Bayes was a statistician, and Bayesian inference is basically a way to update beliefs. So there's this law called Bayes' law, and the very simple way of saying it, as I'd say, is you have prior beliefs, and then you have evidence in the world, right? You have an abstract hypothesis, and then you have concrete evidence. And based on seeing evidence, you can update, these beliefs get updated. So Bayesian refers to this concept of updating beliefs, prior beliefs getting updated by evidence. And that's very simply, probably the simplest way of understanding this concept of Bayesian inference. Beliefs getting updated by making, through evidence. So prior beliefs, posterior beliefs, and these get updated based on seeing evidence. So it's a way to kind of update beliefs about the world.
Okay.
Two is the concept of Markov blankets is a way to essentially, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, and to the extent that we want to get into the weeds or the extent we want to stay high level, you let me know too, is a way to formalize this concept of the difference between internal and external states, which allow us to talk about an interaction an agent has with its environment. This interaction, specifically with Markov blankets, is conditionally independent. What does that mean in the world of statistics? That means that there's no direct connectivity between internal and external states. The interactions between internal and external states are mediated through a Markov blanket. An intermediary firmament potentially, where this blanket mediates the information flows between internal and external states. So this is how one can think about Markov blankets, where interactions between internal and external states, but they're mediated through this blanket. So there's no direct contact. And again, it happens through sensory and active states. Sensory states impact internal states and active states impact external states in this kind of it's symmetric way. So it's a simple way to, again, formalize identity and an agent's interaction with its environment.
Okay. Well, cool. So the idea of Bayesian, is this what would lead us towards more of a Gaussian type of worldview where there's a set of parameters, there's a set of facts, there's a set of inputs, and over time as those variables change, we would update sort of our map of how this statistical probability or this inference or event would happen?
So from the Bayesian world, how does this impact our day to day? If we think about it in our day to day, we're always updating our beliefs. These aren't necessarily they can be propositional beliefs, like what we think about the world, our value preferences, but we are always kind of updating our beliefs. And what the Bayesian brain does is it defines a generative model of the world. In the mathematics terms, this is the solution to the non-equilibrium steady state solution to the Fokker-Planck equation, but we don't need to get there. But yeah, the simplest way of thinking about it is that every agent, me and you included, we have this internal generative model of the world that has our beliefs about the world. And as we interact with our environment and we interact with others, these beliefs get updated over time. And the interesting question becomes, what distinguishes us versus animals and things like that. But this is the simple way of thinking about it exactly, which is we all have an internal generative model of the world that parameterizes what we believe about the external world. So this is how it impacts, and it can be applied to sentient beings like us. Yes.
Okay. And then the nature of Markov blankets, again, from my more of a business background, I'm normally thinking of Markov blankets in terms of parental-child relationships, sort of derivatives, that sort of thing, and looking at, a certain amount of relationships away from a primary. So if it's a stock, let's say it's Microsoft stock, I'm looking at things like capital costs, the interest rates on capital costs, but beyond that, I'm not really looking at the other variables there. If I'm looking at commercial real estate, I'm looking at occupancy levels, and I'm looking at the credit worthiness of the tenants, but I'm not going to look at the deep dive of the industries that the tenants are in to find out the risk profiling there of that specific piece of commercial real estate. And so it sounds like maybe we're talking about two different things, but you're talking about getting the inner core of someone or an idea and the external somethingness of an idea of a person to interface with a Markov blanket.
Yeah, let's use the world of business as an analogy. We both come from M&A backgrounds, right? There's different scales of Markov blankets. So another way to potentially intuitive think about it is like, we are Markov blankets, our families are Markov blankets, our organizations are Markov blankets, and our societies and civilizations. There's Markov blankets at every single scale of this hierarchy. For the example that you were mentioning about, let's take an example of a company. Your company, right, and your people, the people that you work with and, are on payroll, are within your Markov blanket. But of course, you interact with other people as well. You interact with vendors. In the world of M&A, you can potentially think about buying another company. So it was interesting, actually, now that I think about it, being sitting in the M&A seat and thinking about what does the landscape of competitors look like? Should we potentially buy one company or another? In fact, this was, now that I think about it, me at the edge of my company's Markov blanket, thinking about, which companies to buy, which companies to buy, and seeing what happens at the market, which could be similar to like the mediations that occur between internal and external states. And then, of course, if you buy a company, then they become part of your Markov blanket. So that's how I would kind of think about it in terms of, in the world of, in the corporate world, as well as kind of in the day to day and the types of communities that you are a part of. Is that helpful by any chance?
Yes. Very helpful. Very helpful. So as we move through this thesis that you had, again, the thesis, let me just reiterate, is that meaning manifests when the pattern of nature and the pattern of man match. And so we've talked about sort of that meaning manifesting portion, the last few minutes. Then you compare these two patterns, just the pattern of nature and the pattern of man, and that they need to match. And so, first of all, why are we talking about patterns, or why did your thesis come up with the idea of patterns? And secondly, are we thinking about patterns in the Platonic sense? Are we thinking about the patterns in some other sort of organic sense that may be fluctuating based off of changing variables, things of that sort?
So yeah, very simply, meaning is when the pattern of man and the pattern of nature match. And then the question is, what are these patterns to begin with? To answer your meta question of why focus on patterns, this was an intuitive choice. The reason why, if I had to think about it, was I was probably looking for things that are invariant in nature, things that stay consistent throughout time. So you can say patterns, you could say laws as well, natural laws. And I was kind of looking for, these patterns or laws that are invariant in nature. And you have the laws, you have the natural laws in science, the folks of the work from Newton, Galileo, and these folks. And then you have the moral laws. And I think you've touched on this in the past too. And I was kind of thinking about, and this takes things a step further, but, there's a difference between kind of a pattern such as F equals ma, a rock falling, and a moral law or a moral pattern too. So to me, this alignment between when the pattern of man and the pattern of nature match was this exploration of natural laws and exploring basically to me, when the natural law and the moral law align, there is some sort of resonance that occurs that I was interested in exploring. And of course, C.S. Lewis explores this type of work too, and discerning what the difference between moral and natural law are. And the difference between the moral law is this free will aspect. One can choose to follow a law or not. And this was my interest in patterns, or you can call them laws, and exploring what are things that are invariant throughout time. What are things that stay constant? And then, of course, I added the difference between moral law and natural law. So that was my focus on patterns, finding things that are invariant through nature, and the relationship between things that are invariant and conservation laws that you get in physics. There's a correlation there too. Specifically, there's this theorem called Noether's theorem, which talks about this relationship between things that are invariant and things that are consistent. So that was my interest on patterns specifically. And maybe I'll pause there, and then I'll get into what exactly these patterns are, or how I thought about them from a first principles perspective. And then there's of course this alignment aspect of things, and what happens when this alignment occurs is what I would argue is the interesting the interesting thing to parse out. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so you gave a couple of different areas, a couple of different domains of what would constitute a pattern. You talked about laws, you talked about the idea of free will, the moral law, that sort of thing. And, in Lewis that you referenced, he said that free will is the only thing that makes any evil possible. But it's also the only thing that makes any love worth having. And so if we understand that the moral law, which is obviously always contingent on the nature of free will, having a choice whether to do the thing or not to do the thing, or allow the thing to happen or not to allow the thing to happen, that is a contingent element of having a moral law, from my opinion. But then you also tied in that there's a relationship between that and natural law, the idea of forces and masses in physics. And I would imagine that also goes all the way potentially into the area of quantum mechanics, the quantum level, this idea of the unknowingness and the observer interference with the electron and so forth there. And that probably all propagates through a series of hierarchies and, Bayesian models and these various Markov blankets, through a variety of systems, I would imagine. I imagine it's not a very simplistic model to be able to connect all that. And so I would be curious to find out, is there a simple way to explain, how you would define models? Because you've kind of given us these broad elements of laws in nature, but also sort of the laws in us as mankind in our role as a participant in nature. And so I guess do you have a simplistic definition of how you would define matter within the context of the natural domain?
Yeah. So let's use the example of, let's continue using the example of the Bayesian brain to double click on what exactly do we mean by model, and then try to connect it with nature and potentially, symbolic and narrative architecture that we find in mythopoetic works. So to me, what is this concept of model? In the world of machine learning, people put together different models. And I think the simplest way, at least for us to think about it, is at a high level describing what this Bayesian model looks like. So at a high level, we go back to the Bayesian world and we have abstract beliefs and then evidence. The simplest way of thinking about it probably is that there's three main components of a model, at least in the world of the Bayesian brain. In the Bayesian brain, we have a recognition model that has top-down priors about what the world looks like, right? These are our beliefs about the world. And then we have bottoms-up sensory data, which is called a recognition model. And they impinge on each other in an hourglass shape at a pivot point called the feature vector. So very simply, we have three aspects to this quote-unquote model. We have the recognition model, top-down beliefs. We have a feature vector where there's this impingement between abstract and concrete, beliefs versus evidence. And then there's the sensory model, which is the recognition model, which is bottoms-up sensory data. So this is at the very simple architecture, the way in which we can think about a model for the Bayesian brain. So what I was interested in doing, and I'll take this a step further, was then actually let me take a step back. This model, this generative model, feature vector recognition model, is nested hierarchically as well. So this is at a high level what we can define a model using the Bayesian brain. So I was doing some work on reading folks like Arthur Young and his reflexive universe, and I came across a pattern that was actually very similar to this generative model feature vector recognition model that I saw in the Bayesian brain. And Arthur Young, to transfer over to the world of nature, he looks to repurpose and recategorize our science that we have accumulated over the past couple hundred centuries in this very simple model. And his nomenclature is inspired by this Neoplatonic emanation emergence aspect. So what he defines and how he describes science is he talks about this involution, which is this light condensing into matter through the subatomic particles, through atoms, and then through molecules. And there's this turn where neg entropy kicks in, where life kicks in. And this starts this evolutionary process where the freedom that was lost on the way down from this involution, this potentiality to actuality, this freedom to constraint, this freedom is captured again on the way up as evolution evolves from molecules to plants to animals and ultimately humans. So happy to get into a little bit more detail there. But basically what I saw was this very interesting overlap between what we saw in the Bayesian brain and what we saw in nature via Arthur Young's work, where he articulated it as involution to evolution through a turn, this all-important turn. So the work that I was doing was exploring the connectivity between the two and putting these two in dialectic to see what we could potentially parse out. Because to me, it was a really interesting resonance to further explore, of which we could also find resonance in some of the symbolic work in the Western canon, the biblical narrative too, which we'll go one step at a time. But this was kind of the idea that I was looking to parse out with regard to this model, how some of this, the core underlying structure of the model could also be used to cleanly interpret this involution evolution theme that we see in nature. And as an extension, some of the work that we see, there's some of the symbolic and narrative structures we see in the biblical works.
So the model that he presented, this conversion of light into atomic structures, finally into material, that at the bottom, this term that you talked about is sort of the creation of life, of a bit of life that then builds on that into maybe the more formal domiciles like, rats and cats and horses and potentially even man in the end, that at the top, the very start and the very end of those two things, light and man, that's where freedom is maximal. But obviously in light is a very, it's not very trusting. You never know what's going to become of light. You can't really track it. You really can't nail it down. But the imminence of man in sort of the top of that reversion seems to be the totality of freedom, but also there's an element of purpose there because it has sort of that divine spark that came somewhere between the creation of life and that ascendance. Did I understand that correctly?
Exactly. And so there's these interesting themes between each of the various levels, right? You can talk about level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. You mentioned purpose, right? To use some of Aristotle's language, his metaphysics, he has final cause, material cause, formal cause, and efficient cause. And these are 4 ways of describing an object. He typically uses the example of a chair. To your point, level 1 and stage 1 and stage 7, they they pertain to purpose, and they pertain to this sense of wholeness. So this evolutionary process starts and ends with wholeness, but this wholeness is a bit different as it goes through the process of learning and transformation, right? The wholeness at the end, there's this sense of beauty, right? You can use the Garden of Eden or the city of Jerusalem to use biblical language. And this wholeness ends up discretizing into parts. And then there's this reintegrated wholeness. And then the freedom that's lost on the descent again gets recaptured. So again, potentiality to actuality to recapture the original freedom that was lost on the way down. And this to me is a very fascinating way to reinterpret the story of science, leveraging this Aristotelian and Neoplatonic intuition that, was common to ancient thinkers a couple millennia ago. But that's exactly right on that concept of purpose. And then again, this interplay between freedom and constraint, wholes and parts, and the process of transformation, this learning process that occurs, you could argue is this creation of beauty in the sense, this interplay between wholes and parts, this interplay between order and chaos. But that's exactly right on that purpose element at stage 1 and stage 7.
Okay, and then let me try to make sure I understand that everyone that's watching understands this as well. This idea of the 4 stages of 4 levels of Aristotle's causes. Right? It's like when you ask a scientist, well, how did life come about? They're going to try to take the mathematical, technical answer to that, but he asks a child, like, how did life become about? Well, it's because my mommy and my daddy got married. They answer the questions in different ways, and this is really what Aristotle's doing, sort of in these 4 causes. You got the level 1 cause, the purpose, the why. What was the purpose? Why this thing was created? Yes. The carpenter needed to have a place for his child to sit at the end of the table.
Yes.
Then you got the material cause is these trees were once grown into forests, and we thought that this would be hard and this would be right to be able to build this. You got the 3rd level where I think you sort of have this pattern, it's this blueprint, right? Like, how do you build the chair? All right, like you put these things together. It's this blueprint, exactly. Yeah. That's right. And then that's a little bit more of what you're talking about here. And then you have this idea of the efficient cause, about like what are all these sort of inputs? This is sort of the efficient cause. How do you put the chair together, right? You put one leg at a time. And I would even go so far as to say, in the world that we live in now, we have this focus via the power of science and technology. We have this focus on efficient cause, right? Because, through the post-Enlightenment area where we really focused on reason, we saw the power of man to find these laws of nature that were invariant. We leveraged these laws, and which started the Industrial Revolution, information technology revolution in the world today. But the issue that I would probably posit is that we've lost this sense of depth and purposiveness that pervaded pre-modern views, where now we focus on efficient causes, but we think that that's the only thing that exists. This world bounded by time and space, to use more cosmic language. But in fact, there's a whole aspect of depth that we lose when we only focus on efficient cause or how to change things. And this final cause, right? This purpose, this why, the sense of meaning, which is primary in the ontology of things, I would argue gets lost today. So it's the work and the effort here is bringing this philosophical depth and maturity up to the might of our material maturity by reinstilling, this sense of depth, this purposeness, this metaphysics, that once we do so, we can see actually there's a luminous thread that occurs between nature, man, and myth. But that's why, again, this is the power of the Aristotelian metaphysics. Yeah. And I think part of the importance here is for those that maybe don't quite understand everything that Tomer just said, if you think about it in terms of not building animals or what happens in life, think of it in terms of sort of all 4 of those Aristotelian types of principles. How are you going to build a child? You're not just going to tell them how they were born, how they were formed. You're not going to tell them just about the raw materials. You're going to tell them you're talking about purpose and why, what their end goal is, and why they were created. And you're going to talk about what is the pattern of a man? Like, what does a right man, what does a right girl do in the end? Well, they engage in love, they engage in beauty, they engage in work, all these sorts of things. And so I think everything you're talking about is a formula in a way of how you can do the more purposeful things in life without always talking about it in an ethereal node. You can talk about it more in the concrete, like what we as men can do, how we can support, women and children and coworkers and other people that we will instill confidence in. How can we respect our parents and realize, why do I always do this whenever I get angry? Well, it's because, there's some other influences there, and you can sort of use some of these frameworks for a lot of that. I think they're really, really useful. Now, you talked about this idea of the pattern of man. And so walk me through that in a very simplistic fashion about what that means. Are you talking about there's one ultimate pattern of a man? Is this a way that we should act, a way should we work, a way should we think, a way should we should be? What all is constituted in this phrase, the pattern of man?
So what you said about the pragmatic element before I hop into the pattern of man, I wholeheartedly agree. Oftentimes we can get caught in the theoretical world, but this can be used to, the manifestation of a goal is the same aspect where you have this idea, this belief, and you actualize this goal, right? The potential is the ability for you to complete a half marathon, to do that art project that you've always wanted to do. And then the manifestation of that goal is the actualization of that. So manifestation of a goal in psychology also can be used. And then also like a love story in our daily lives too is another way of thinking about when these patterns align. So yeah, wholeheartedly agree. Oftentimes the pragmatic import is, I would even argue, primary compared to all this philosophical musing too of how can this actually impact the day-to-day actions you take to live a more fulfilling and meaningful life. With regards to this pattern of man, this again was used as a way to formalize the model of the Bayesian brain. And I think it may be interesting to explore the biblical story if we want to go there and see how this pattern that I talked about, this generative model, feature vector recognition model, it finds its way in the biblical story too, because then we actually get into the world of human nature. You can talk about, religion. You can also talk about it as a way to deeply understand human nature. But, in the biblical story, what you end up seeing, to broaden the aperture of items we can talk about, is this generative model becomes the law, Moses' law, be it through the Old Testament. The turn becomes confrontation of sin or this Christ event. And then the recognition model becomes the church. To use Pagot's language, law is lowering meaning, and then raising matter becomes the church. And so you have this interesting juxtaposition to wrap up the connectivity between nature, the Bayesian brain, and man, where you have this, this chiastic structure, both in the symbolic structure and narrative structure of the biblical works. That is, again, an interesting mental model to think about both the structure of the biblical works and how you deal with difficulties, confrontation of sin, and also the importance of action and aligning your action with that natural law that we talked about. So let me know where you want to take this conversation, but to bring it to the world, the biblical world at a very high level, you also have this aspect of priestly, kingly, or forming, filling, or law, church via this pivot point or feature vector or center of the chiasm or Christ that provides this really interesting mental model to understand the biblical story as well, which is another potential pattern of man or pattern of nature that can be used to understand the world a little bit more.
Okay. And so that's very helpful. So when we talk about patterns, there's three different ways I can interpret this, because we talked about the patterns of nature, and I think that I thought about that in one sense. But when we start talking about the pattern of man, I can think about it in three different ways. I can think about it the way it seems that mankind came about and what we typically do. There's the idea, so that's what kind of sort of one definition of pattern. Another definition of pattern could be what it seems that we do from how we observe. So this is like the knowable things that we do and the things that we do, but known and unknown, right? So this is sort of like the Platonic thing. So the Platonic, as soon as we do, it's the things that we observe that we do. And then the kind of the third element of the pattern of man is what we ought do, like what the ideal man would do. And so obviously with nature, there's only the things that we observe and we speculate that they do. And you could take that biblical framework and use the redemptive model of nature that it's crying out sort of in the Romans 8 through 12 sort of aspect for the redemption of the sons of man to see who those see what's going to happen there. That there's this yearning there. But I think for the most part, you're probably talking about when it comes to nature, that it's what it tends to do, what scientific and the great theories seem to have it do. But man, you have these three different options: what we observe it doing, what it does, and that we know about and we don't know about, and also the ideal what man should be, what the ideal form of man would be. Walk me through what your intentions are there and what we should be looking for. Then I think you could probably tie that back into the biblical framework if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So it's this natural law which exists, and then what we ought to do, we alluded to it a little bit before, and where I think about, again, similar to this future vector integrating tops down and bottoms up processes to guide intelligent behavior. Again, you have this descending arc of creation, and then you have ascending arc of redemption. I think to your point, this ought to is the interesting aspect of things. It's almost like this first part is learning the law, right? And then the second aspect is applying the law. So learning cause and effect, and then using effect to drive cause. And that to me is the crux of that, which is at the center of the chiasm or the turn in nature or the future vector. It is this instilling of conscious action where you can use what you've learned to inform volitional choice and behavior. So, and this goes back to aligning the natural law with the moral law too, that you get in the works of C.S. Lewis, where we have this freedom, we have this free will, and you have to kind of learn the law, learn cause and effect before you can use effect to generate cause, to use the law to where you want to go. And so this is how I think about kind of closing this law that we see in nature, and then this ought as well. And it's up to us, right? We have the free will, right? The very simple way to bring ourselves down from the language of abstraction is, let's say a child touches the stove and they get burned, and therefore they know that, on the next rodeo, they now know that, all right, if I touch a stove, I get burned. They've learned cause and effect. And then that gets inputted in their generative model of the world, and they don't, they don't touch the stove anymore to that effect. So it's this idea of leveraging the learning of the law and then applying it to inform conscious action in a way that's ideally aligned with what we see in nature too, which is a broader conversation. But it's this importance of consciousness and volitional choice that I think is at the crux and pivot of things oftentimes.
Okay. That's very, very helpful. So I want to get back to this idea of maybe these three different ideas of mankind. And you used the child example about touching the stove. And so, when I first became a parent, I saw my kids at the stove. I'm thinking to myself, well, this kid's an idiot. Like it's red hot. They should know it's, but I'm not going to tell the kid he's an idiot. I don't have any boys, so I'm using a hypothetical kid here. So if I can tell the kid he's an idiot, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give him medicine. I'm going to give him ice. I'm going to take care of him. And then I'm going to encourage him that he's not an idiot, that he's really very, very bright. He's very, very smart. And I'm going to treat him as if he was already that person that I knew he could be. And I think that is a little bit different because I'm a man of faith. I speak the truth of the future possibility of what someone can be more than I treat them as if what they really appear to be. And so when we think about interfacing with nature, interfacing with mankind, interfacing with these patterns, we can interface with them in one of two ways. Nature, I can interface with nature how it is, or I can interface with nature as the becoming redemptive nature that it's meant to be, that I believe it will become at one point. And those are two different realities. One's the reality of the now, but one's the reality of the perpetual of what it will be for a much longer duration than it is now with nature. But the same is true when I deal with you, when I deal with my coworkers, when I deal with my friends, and when I deal with my wife and my kids. I can deal with them, I can interface with them through the lens of what they are now, or I can take that step of faith and I can treat them and I can speak truth into them, and I can speak the future capability, the future competency that they are going to have, that I believe that they're going to have that. And I think when we do that, we speak to them more than more into them than with a pattern of what exists. We speak into them the future of what we believe by faith will happen. And I think that is where we begin to take on power in ourselves. And when we speak to the future, what we would have that future to become, rather than just speaking the present of what it is and document what it is.
I love that. Yeah. This concept of leveraging future potential, which is aligned with what we talked about earlier with this arc too. It's the level 7 of, right? We have level 4, which is the process of transformation, growth, and change. And then we have level 7, which is this potentiality and this to maybe, it's speaking to where someone can be, that future potential and also letting someone get there on their own accord, right? You could, if you're teaching your kid to play or your son to play baseball, at the end of the day, he's the one that's taken he's the one that's taken the swing and he's the one that's going to be on the field. It's his actions and his free will. But you as a father or as a friend can support and can be there for when he has questions, right? Or when he wants to drag you to like catch over the weekends. But this agency ultimately has to come from him. But yeah, I love this idea of the ought to, the remembering the future potential and the encouragement too. And, there will be ups and downs too. There will be knees skid, but always, this is more of a motivational aspect, but, always the aspect of getting up, confronting challenges or difficulty, which is what happens at the center of chiasm, is the ultimate learning process. But I love that ought to and that relationship to future potentiality and what you can be to encourage.
I think the idea, and I want to get your question on this, maybe you've researched this some, but this idea of interfacing. Obviously, if I interface with a child and say that she's brilliant, she's lovely, she's going to make the best mom in the world, I was speaking those things into her out of faith. They're not a factual truth because she's not a mother yet, but I speak to them out of faith. And it seems that that's one of the few ways where you can really get growth, because you have that transfer of meaning and purpose. It's an imputation of it, really, by way, through a parent or through a mentor type of figure, which is really, really powerful. And so you have this dichotomy between speaking truth and speaking sort of the future. And I guess that's what the whole industry of positive speaking is about. But I think I heard you on Karen Wong's show, The Meaning Code, which is, I highly recommend everyone to go back and listen to it. It's a more deep dive. Karen's much wiser than I am, so she's able to have a more intellectual conversation with you. This idea of what truth is, and I think we're talking about truth in the capital T sense. And when you say that meaning manifests, is it the same thing as saying that meaning aligns itself, or a man aligns himself with a capital T truth? Yes. And is there a difference there? So kind of walk me through sort of your theory, what you've researched on the idea of capital T truth, and sort of our role as men, as people in a functioning society, to align ourselves to that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's aligning to yourself to what is true with a capital T. What is truth, right? Like, especially in this day and age, I think in the modern world, there has been quite the assault on truth with a capital T, right? People are now free to come up with their own truths in a sense, right? And of course, this is in the context of a world in which freedom is the ultimate value that we've prescribed, right? And so even taking a step back, this relationship that we have with truth is really interesting. And there is such thing as truth with the capital T. You go all the way back to the time of Plato and Aristotle, the true, the good, the beautiful. And things that resonate with the truth, I think, end up being meaningful. And the truth, you could probably argue, is the pattern of nature itself too. What is truth? I think for me, very simply, the way I thought about it is that which is invariant to time and space, which is a fancy way of saying things that, things that are true, right? If one goes back and reads Plato's Timaeus, which is his perspective on cosmology, he has, at the end of that chapter, he applies his intellectual might to understanding, human nature. And it's like, this has been stayed constant throughout thousands of years. And then if you read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which applies his scientific empirical thinking to understanding man, to cultivate ethics and eudaimonia, you also see that there's so much consistency throughout time. And so I do think that it's interesting to think about the relationship we have with truth and how that changed in the modern era. What exactly is truth? And then, of course, aligning ourselves to the truth in the biblical works, right? What is it? I am the truth, the light, the way, the logos. And that alignment, I would argue, the alignment of that creates meaning. And so there's a very close relationship between that which is true, that which is good, which to use philosophical jargon is this identification with the wholeness, that which is beautiful, which is this interplay at the edge of chaos between order and chaos, this complexification over time, this diversity and unity that occurs over time, and love, which, to use the language of complexity, is this yoking force towards self-transcending wholes, right? The many become one and are increased by one, to use Whitehead's terminology, which very simply is the idea of a marriage. A husband and wife come together, the many become one and are increased by one. They have a kid. So I took it a little bit further, but my idea was to think about how the relationship with truth has changed throughout time. What exactly is truth? What happens when we align to truth? And how truth sits within the broader context of other Platonic ideals, which have this kind of interconnected relationship to one another.
Okay. That's very, very helpful. Very, very helpful. All right. So I guess 2 follow-up questions on that I want to get a little bit into your kind of sort of your personal background and what you're working on now. You used the word invariability or some derivative of that word when you gave your definition for truth. And then you also said that sort of the man that aligns himself with truth, with the, I guess, capital universal truth, with that invariability, is also in a way sort of aligning himself with meaning, and obviously the derivative of that is purpose there. So I guess the first question is, are you saying in order for a man or an organization or a woman to find meaning, that they have to be working on something that has invariability and indestructibility? Yeah,
another way of potentially framing it, like, is there something that is invariant, like eternal, I guess, in a sense? There is something to be said about this resonance. I think, to me, the interesting thing that I was, I guess, to take a step back, the interesting thing that I was looking to explore, and I would love to get your color on this, which is going back to this conversation of truth, right? You have Camus and you have Nietzsche that put meaning in the context of the cultural construct and the zeitgeist of the times. So to me, I was thinking about going back to this question of invariance. Is it dependent on the culture and zeitgeist of the times, or is there something that is invariant, that stays constant? Is there something that is part of the cosmological context in which humans are in, to use, I guess, fancy, more poetic terms? And this was what I was trying to think about, which is, and what I propose is, meaning is not simply just an arbitrary human invention, right? Some whimsical definition that we've come up with, but in fact, it is a fundamental feature of a teleologically driven cosmos, of which humans have a unique participatory role with regards to our relationship with, action and free will, and our ability to align ourselves with this truth. This was what I was thinking about when it came to invariance, which is meaning, dependent on culture, or is it up to our interpretation to define, or is it actually part of the evolution of the universe, to use some fancier terms, or is it part of the cosmos? And to me, I think the answer is the latter. It's part of the cosmos. It's what happens when the story of one's life coheres with and personifies these value gradients that pervade the cosmos or nature. And to use, again, poetic terminology, it's what happens when one's life story or experiential path harmonizes with this universal poiesis, right? Again, using more poetic jargon, but that was what I was trying to parse out with regards to this invariant, which is there something inherent to the cosmos that's meaningful? It could be true today. It could be true 2,000 years ago. It could be true 2,000 years in the future. And finding something invariant.
So what was the term you used when you mentioned Camus?
The cultural construct. I'm not sure.
Yeah. They were talking about the idea of purpose and meaning.
Yeah, we create meaning. He has the story of the myth of Sisyphus as the allegory, right? Where, one must imagine Sisyphus happy rolling the mountain up the hill. But to me, I think actually what ends up happening is hear me out, which is as we push this boulder up the hill, the boulder actually, the chunks of the boulder fall to reveal a replica of the person pushing the boulder up the hill. So there's this co-creative dynamic interplay. And at the very top of the mountain, that boulder becomes human or something, right? The tear gets shed, the tear gets shed, to use some of the language from the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. So it's not one must imagine Sisyphus happy. It's there's this co-creative dynamic creative interplay that occurs with nature. And it's up to us to reveal that diamond, to use Aristotle's term, or that sculpture, and become the best version of ourselves, going back to that potentiality that you were talking about, achieving that full potentiality that happens at that top of the mountain.
The interplay between sort of the Platonic truths and the cultural dynamics that Camus would espouse about. I think that's really, really interesting. But I think I would put the cultural dynamics in the same bucket with many or most of the sort of the natural laws, maybe even the moral law, because it seems to me that whatever is changeable and whatever is changing is going to pass away at some time. It's destroyable, as you know, Peterson would say that whatever is destroyable is less real than that which is not destroyable. Yeah. If it can be destroyed, it's less real. And so if nature itself, it just has a longer time frame, most of what we can see in nature is going to be passing away if you have either a scientific or a biblical worldview, or really any framework whatsoever about the natural world. And so that is all passing. And if we're looking for invariability to attach to a capital T truth, and a capital T truth is necessitating what it means to have a true meaning or a true purpose about one's life, it seems that it's in the same bucket. The laws of nature and the laws of sort of communal well-being and community are basically the same thing. They're dust in the end, just along different timelines. And so where does that lead us? I think about Boethius in this. I think about Boethius that if thou expectest to be cured, you must discover thy own wound. If I'm Camus and I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about, how am I going to find something, a purpose, which I don't know if he was even interested in that, but if I was able to find something purposeful, and if I believe that was truth, like I do, for instance, it's you're involving your life in an activity that uncovers, that unveils a capital T truth, right? You're not promoting it because whatever is unchanged is unpromotable. You're not going to add anything to it. You're just going to allow it to be seen by a wider quantity of variability and population there. That if I realize that I can't see it and you can't see it, that's the first step in being able to discover that. But we have to discover that our wound is that we're blind, we're unable to see what the truth is, and we uncover that truth. And we've got to get rid of all this stuff that's not truth.
It's uncover versus discover. It was always there. It's uncovering it. And it is a subtle but profound distinction between this uncovering and discovery process. It was always there, it just required uncovering. It's not that we discovered something new. It was always there, 100%.
In the end, that's the only meaning that you can participate in, because you cannot add or distract from capital T ultimate truth. All you can do is uncover for other people like me and your neighbor and your wife and your kids. That's all that we can do is point. And the pointing is actually the highest activity of any man or woman. Just to point, just to show people where the bread is, in one sense. And I think that's really what you're doing. I'm really impressed by your work. So tell me a little bit about what your end game is here, because you wrote a very substantial paper. You've clearly thought about a lot of this, and I like the fact that you came from the business world like me. It shows that we're not all savages all the time. And, so walk me through sort of like where you see yourself over the next 5 or 10 years, your Substack work and your writing work, and where you think that's going.
I wish I could answer that easily. I think, for me, where am I going? So, I think the rationale for why I started this work was reflecting on what are some of the hardest problems that are facing the world today. And to me, going back to actually what we were just talking about with regards to this idea of culture, I do think the problems that we face today are conceptual versus material in nature. And so the rationale for doing this work was drilling into this philosophical, metaphysical roots to figure out what exactly these cultural issues were by tracing the evolutions of ideas throughout Western civilization. And to what I think how you articulated it was the connectivity between the modern culture and whatever truth the capital T is such an important problem to solve. So I think for me, hard to predict what the future will look like. But I think this type of work of providing maybe, of adding discourse to the culture, grounding our modern, discoveries in mathematics and science in the broader framework of ancient thinking, this merging between modern and ancient, I think is some of the most high leverage work that we can do to enact, meaning and meaning on an individual level. And so what I would love to do is I don't have any vast, become Jordan Peterson's type of the world. I would love to kind of just stay humble, continue to engage in dialogue and discourse with people that are thinking about simple things in good faith. Continue publishing these ideas that I have. And then realistically, I'll probably have to, I'll probably go back to the business world and find a balance between working on this passion, high leverage culture work, as well as, the world of the pragmatic business world, finding the balance between being a priest philosopher and a king, I think is important too. So that's kind of where I see things, kind of open-minded, continuing to engage in talented, thoughtful folks like yourself, continuing to put ideas out there, engaging in dialectics and dialogues, and hopefully, meeting similar people looking to grapple with this, ever difficult question of what it means to be human in the modern world.
What's your writing and thinking process like? Do you have a specific schedule, specific times a day, caffeine use? Tell me all that, how you start to write.
No caffeine use. Even in my banking days, I didn't use caffeine, which is, I don't know how I got through my banking program, but no caffeine use. The way in which going back to the question of law and obedience, I can probably be a bit more obedient and disciplined. Typically, I'm pretty good at self-discipline. I was really interested in triathlons last year, so I used triathlons as my forum for self-discipline. But when it comes to the creative process, really it's just digesting and marinating a variety of different disciplines. So, I'm really interested in right now, and of course, going deeper into the free energy principle, going into Whitehead's work, I'm been interested in theology. So reading the works of Michael Bull, who come in the lineage of James Jordan. And I kind of just let these ideas marinate in the back of my head and then put them in an unconscious dialectic with one another and then try and integrate and differentiate these different ideas from different disciplines. So that's kind of the creative process, which is read, digest, kind of let my intuition follow where I find things are interesting, and then use writing to put different ideas into a dialectic with one another. And, that's the process now. I want to go a little bit deeper in some of the initial musings that I explored in this thesis. And then I also have a couple of, other ideas specifically with regards to our relationship with technology. I want to write about a piece on the ontology of technology. So leveraging folks like Heidegger, Gilbert Simondon to understand the relationship I think we have with units like the binary code and unity itself. And I think Markov blankets can get us this unity aspect. So doing a little bit of work on the relationship, on the ontology and philosophy of technology is next, but we'll see. And then continuing to engage in dialogue with folks like yourself.
Yeah. And how can folks track your work?
Yeah. So for folks that are interested in exploring my work, please feel free to follow me on Twitter, and then please feel free to follow me on my Substack. And I hope to be continuing to publish ideas, engaging in interviews, and talking with folks that are smarter than more experienced than myself, because we could spend an entire lifetime talking about meaning and not get far. So, please feel free to follow me along and reach out if this is of interest to you too.
Tomer, thanks so much for being with us. Everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Please like and subscribe, comment below, and follow Tomer on his various channels. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great one, guys.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Rick.